Welcome to Inheriting the Future. I'm Nate Kirk.
And I'm David Wall. We're two kids from Gaylord, Michigan, who grew up watching incredible people quietly build something worth inheriting.
Before we head off in different directions, we decided to sit down with those people and ask them everything we wish we'd asked sooner.
Because we believe the greatest gift one generation can give the next isn't money or property, it's wisdom.
And we're here to make sure it doesn't get lost.
So our guest today is someone who grew up right here in Gaylord, went out into the world, had the rug pulled out right from under him, and then built something more meaningful than he ever could have planned.
Yeah, so Kurt A. David is an Emmy Award-winning television producer, author, certified counselor, and international keynote speaker. He's the creator, producer, and host of From Glory Days, a show built around one of the most overlooked questions in sports. What happens to an elite athlete after their career ends? He is the co-founder of Purpose Point, a leadership development organization, and the architect of a framework called the 5 Rules, which he has delivered to major corporations and organizations around the world.
But before all of that, he was a professional basketball player, a career that ended not on his own terms, but because of a cataclysmic injury that forced him to walk away from everything he had worked towards. That moment of sudden, unwanted change became the foundation for everything he has built since.
He is a proud graduate of Gaylord St. Mary Cathedral School, and he stands, as he'll tell you himself, at 4 feet 33 inches tall.
So Kurt, welcome to Inheriting the Future. Thank you for being here.
David and Nate, it's an absolute honor. I appreciate it. Fellow snowbirds here, we got to hang together and help each other all the time. And so it's an honor to be here.
Kurt, let's start right here in Gaylord. What do you remember about the day you left this town for the last time before your career took off? And what were you feeling?
Yeah, that's a great question. But, everybody asks about what I do, but I cannot talk about what I do without talking about my foundation, which is in Gaylord. And 12 years of Gaylord St. Mary's. My mother, for those of us that are from Gaylord, probably remember my mother, Geraldine David. She was a gym teacher, athletic director, coach, playground supervisor, did that for almost 50 years between the time that she worked there and then retired and came back and volunteered. And I always say that my foundation was built on the fact that there was 8 of us in a house with 1 bathroom. So you learn early on that life is not all about you, right? You learn to share, you learn to grow together and argue together and have conflict and resolve that conflict. And so that's one of the things that I, remember from my foundation as far as leaving Gaylord. It was amazing. I had the opportunity to play in college, played college ball, then had the opportunity to play professionally overseas. And one of the concerns, leaving Gaylord is growing up in a small town and all of a sudden I'm in another country whose language I didn't speak, and I had no idea what to expect as far as basketball. It ended up being a wonderful experience where, we were undefeated for the seasons and, won the league and just, lots of accolades and groupies. And it was a paid vacation, basically, I called it. Got to see a lot of the countries around the area. But I always remember my foundation, Gaylord. I have still a lot of friends that I grew up with that keep in contact with on and off and teammates. And it's just, that foundation, I think growing up in Northern Michigan is special. In fact, anytime I meet somebody from Northern Michigan, regardless of where I'm at, if I meet somebody from Northern Michigan, it's kind of a common kindred that we have because we know what it's like up there.
Yeah, I love hearing that story, just staying grounded and reminding myself not to take anything for granted because what we have, like you said, is special. So, was there ever a moment in that process where you were really doubting yourself leaving such a small Northern Michigan town and an even smaller school with such a big dream? Like, what served as your biggest source of motivation as you basically trailblazed your own path into the unknown?
Yeah, yeah. Fortunately, sports was the ticket, right? I knew basketball at that time. Like Nate mentioned, I'm 4 foot and 33 inches. And for those of us that got an F in math, that means 6'9". And so my height was a blessing as far as playing basketball. Not that, that was when I got to the higher levels, everybody's that size. But, my point is that fortunately I had a ticket and that was basketball. And, the 6 of us kids All six of us were on full ride athletic scholarship, and two of us played professionally. So imagine that household growing up there in Gaylord at Gaylord St. Mary's, very competitive. But back to your question, David, I think the biggest thing is understanding that because of basketball, you had opportunities, right? And I remember getting lots of D1 offers and thinking, oh, okay, boy, this is very attractive. I can go to this D1 school. But I chose a D2 school instead, Saginaw Valley State, because I knew I could come in right away, start right away, contribute right away. I do have to be honest with you. It was a roller coaster, though. When you get to college, and this is what I tell my daughter who's going to Florida to play soccer next year. I said, I've played high school, college, and professionally, but high school is the most fun, right? You get to college, you get to professional level, it's more business-like. And that's one of the things that I probably was not prepared for was that business aspect of sports, even at a Division II level, and especially at the professional level. But, adjusted quickly. I think I did a lot better after I got out of college as far as my confidence level, realizing that, boy, I do have an opportunity. Let me take advantage of it. And so, it is the roller coaster of sports, and anybody that plays sports understands that. It's not a straight line. There is no straight line. There's no straight line up to the mountain. In fact, it's easier to get to the mountain and stay on top of the mountain. And that's one of the challenges for anybody that plays sports.
Obviously, you growing up here in Gaylord and getting all these D1 offers. I mean, it's truly extraordinary. But what did growing up here give you that you don't think you could have gone anywhere else?
Well, you know what? I think the values. I think, specifically going to Gaylord St. Mary's, I think one of the best things is I tell people I learned every Bible story in the book, right? You hear about the Bible, learn about the Bible, being raised Catholic. And I'm convinced that, when we reach those pearly gates or whatever it is that we reach in heaven, that it's not, well, you're Catholic and you're in, or you're Baptist, you're in. It's, what do you do with Jesus? What do you believe in Jesus? And that's the foundation that I think was built from my years of being at Gaylord St. Mary's. And so, my faith is a very important part of who I am today. And I think probably the biggest thing is I think you either got to believe the Bible's true or it's not true. And if you believe it's true, we're promised eternal life through our faith in Jesus Christ. And if you don't believe it's true, well, I'll leave that between you and God. But I think that's the biggest thing growing up in Gaylord, going to Gaylord St. Mary's. From what I understand, I graduated, there was 60 kids, 60 students in my class when I graduated. And the last picture I saw, it's much smaller than that at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah, we had 18 people when we graduated just the other day, so I can like walking down the halls, it's super cool that they do have that tradition of having all the classes on the wall, but it's crazy to think of how many people to fit in that same size school in my opinion. But I mean, making it from that obviously small school to professional basketball, for most people that's the dream. What did it actually feel like to be living that, and how did that shape who you were at that point in your young career?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is I remember at my house in Gaylord during that time, I had three workouts pinned up on my bedroom wall that every time I left my bedroom, I saw it right there by the door. My morning workout, my afternoon workout, my evening workout. It was different things. One was a weight training, one was a conditioning, one was a skill work. And I just remember those months of preparation before leaving for Europe and just how focused I needed to be. And I was fortunate that my mother had the keys to the gym. I think that was a huge part of it, right? For all six of us kids, when you have a key to the gym like that, boy, Christmas Day, you can open presents. Next thing you know, you're getting the guys together to go play a game, right? And so that was a huge benefit. And so that's the biggest thing is you learn, and like everybody, growing up in Northern Michigan, I use this saying because people down here maybe don't understand it in Metro Detroit or other areas, but when you see a turtle on top of a fence post, you know that it didn't get up there by itself. And so there was a lot of people along the way, my coaches and friends and other players that I played against. Surprisingly, when we had those pickup games at St. Mary's during that time, there was probably 6, 7, 8 college players that would come back and play from Gaylord area. And so it was refreshing to have other players that just weren't high school players, but college players. And, it kept the competition good when it came to games and whatnot. But very fortunate, very grateful for those opportunities. I kind of joke when people say, oh, you played professional basketball. I laugh. I said, yeah, that was a different life ago, right? I don't go by years. I go by pounds. That was 40 pounds ago. And so it was just a whole different life at that time. But, it really gave me an opportunity to learn how to use what I learned in sports to apply to the next part of my life.
That's awesome, really, that you got to play at the pro level. But unfortunately, you did suffer an unfortunate injury. When your basketball career ended so suddenly, what was the first thought that went through your mind? And at what point did it start to feel like a beginning rather than an ending?
Yeah, change. That's what was going through my mind. And, it was one of those injuries. I hyperextended my knee and tore both my meniscuses as a result. And I remember going in for knee surgery much, long after I did it. I actually kept playing for a while and I knew I wasn't 100%, but I knew it was going to be over. I just knew it. I went in for knee surgery and the orthopedic surgeon said, Kurt, you can keep playing basketball, but not walk by the time you're 40 or give it up. And as a 26, 27-year-old young man who, just was living the dream, so to speak, it was very difficult. I mean, I was angry. I remember laying on my parents' couch in Gaylord following knee surgery and thinking, wow, I'm angry. I'm having so much fun traveling around, opportunity, and I just couldn't play at that level anymore, right? After surgery, I played a little bit for a while, just pick up games and a couple local leagues, but just nowhere near that level again. I knew I couldn't, and thank God I stopped because I wanted to be able to walk by the time I was 40. And being a little bit over that right now, I know that if it wasn't for stem cell therapy and some other therapies I had, I probably would have had a knee replacement by now, to be honest.
So you obviously took all of that and reinvented yourself and ended up in television, but never really completely left the sports world. How did From Glory Days come to exist, and what made that you realize that the transition out of sports was the story worth telling?
Yeah, no, part of the story that is worth telling is that when I was done playing basketball, I had an elementary education degree. So one of the things I knew was I wanted to get my degree before I left to go to Europe. And so I finished my degree in elementary education, was an elementary teacher. And when I came back, there was an opportunity to be a varsity coach and teacher at Gaylord St. Mary's. And so here I am back in Gaylord, resting from my knee stuff. And it's like, oh, there's an opportunity. Okay, let me teach and coach here. And I got into teaching and coaching at Gaylord St. Mary's and continued and went and got a master's degree as part of that, to get a master's in counseling. So then I shifted into counseling, becoming a middle school counselor and a varsity basketball coach. Well, partway through that journey, I had an idea. And that idea was to sit down with other former professional athletes and hear about how their success stories after pro sports. So I sat down with 20 former Pistons, Tigers, Red Wings, and Lions and wrote their stories about how they created success following pro sports. So guys like Dave Bing, who's a NBA Hall of Famer from the Pistons, created a $400 million business, following his pro sports career. Allen Houston, who played in Detroit, but also played in New York and made hundreds of millions of dollars. He literally, his career ended very abruptly as well. And how did he recreate his success afterwards emotionally? And different Lions and different Tigers and Red Wings. And to hear their story, it was really amazing. And the surprising part is I did about 60 book signings in the first 3 months when the book was released, and it did very well. And I remember sitting down saying, boy, this is bigger than the book. Let's do something more. And that's when I started sitting down with radio producers, TV producers, and saying, hey, let's do something. And then TV is what took off. So we did a first season, and then we did 3 more seasons. We did 4 seasons of the show. I've done 50 TV interviews for the show. And it's amazing to sit down with these Hall of Famers, all-star world champions, and hear their story about how they recreated success again. And each one has their own story as a result. The neat part about that is as I'm doing this, I'm looking for patterns, right? As a counselor, you look for patterns. And I'm looking for patterns of these athletes. And I started seeing a commonality of success. And that's what created my 5 rules. In other words, RULES is an acronym actually for the 5 things that these athletes did to create success. So then I started speaking on that topic. I started working with other former pro athletes and Olympic athletes. And then I started speaking to corporations about change and transition and started expanding this further to how do we lead change? How do we communicate change? How do we change? And it just has spun into this 18 years of professional speaking now, too, where I do keynote speaking and workshops on the topic of change.
That's awesome. And obviously, you've had the privilege to sit across from Hall of Famers, All Stars, world champions, and ask them what happens when the lights go out, when the careers end. Most fans never hear that side of the story. So, what part of that chapter of an athlete's life would most surprise people, even people who follow sports closely?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing are the exit stats. In other words, the exit stats are this: 25% of NFL players within the first year out of pro sports are broke. 25%. 78% of NFL players within the first 2 years are broke. NBA is not much better. 60%, 60, of NBA players within 5 years are broke. And there's an 80% divorce rate for transitioning athletes from job loss to disaster. That's the reality for these pro athletes. And, I've had people say, oh, they're out cheating on their wives and stuff, and that's why they get divorced. Well, maybe some are, and that's what you read in the news. But think about this for a moment. I don't care how much money you make. If you go from being on the road 6 months out of the year to all of a sudden you're toe to toe with your spouse every single day with a 95% pay cut, I don't I don't know what marriage is going to survive that, to be honest. And so that's part of the problem with these exits. When the pro athletes come out, that's the reality of what happens. And so, that's the sobering part, and that's why it was so intriguing for me to hear the success stories. How did you get through this? How did you get through that downturn? There's identity problems, like athletes that's their identity. If their sport is their identity, they're in trouble when they're over because that identity's gone. They have to find a new identity, a new purpose, a new passion. They have to let go of many things as well, and that's part of my 5 rules that I talk about when they go in transition. That helps them in transition pro sports.
Is there a particular guest or conversation that has stuck with you over the years? I know you've spoken in the past about getting to speak with people like Ray Lewis. What's that experience like?
So, Ray was probably the most humble guy. I expected him to walk in with a lot of swagger, cocky, arrogant, and he was probably the most humble because, towards the end of the interview, I asked him, I said, of all the accolades you had, 2-time Super Bowl champion, MVP, all these all pro sports awards, what was the what was the one that meant the most to you? And he looked at me, he says, yeah, seeing the look on my mother's face when they unveiled a statue out in front of Baltimore Stadium. That's the best award I've ever had. And, just that kind of an answer was just the way he carried himself. Two other guys that really jump out at me. One was a former Detroit Lion, Eric Hipple, who lost his 15-year-old son by suicide shortly after he got out of pro football. And, that was a spiral for him. And Eric ended up becoming an advocate for depression, talking to men and military about depression. So he took a tragedy and turned it into a triumph. That was probably an impactful one. And then the most impactful as far as life-changing story that I heard was a guy out of Ottawa, Canada. His name is Doug Smith. Doug Smith was such a phenomenal interview. We had him on 2 different seasons. But Doug's story is he's from Ottawa, Canada. He was the number 2 draft pick in the NHL. Not the first pick, but he was the second pick in the NHL. Went from Ottawa, Canada to Los Angeles. And he talked about it being a free fall. He says, man, here I am, 19 years old, money in my pocket, driving a Porsche, condo on the beach. It was just like life of Riley, right? Just a free fall. Well, at 27 years old, he was playing in a professional hockey game, went headfirst into the boards, and instantly became a quadriplegic. Snapped his neck, nothing from the neck on down. So here Doug Smith went from being a high-class, high-caliber pro athlete to all of a sudden no functions from the neck on down. He even talked about how he couldn't even take his own life because he had nothing, and he was very despondent. Well, his wife noticed how despondent he was and said, listen, honey, I can't imagine what you're experiencing, but I love you. You have 2 beautiful daughters that love you. You have a lot to live for. And Doug went on to share that that was his seminal moment that changed his attitude, changed his outlook, and said, you know what, we need to figure this out. And over the course of the next 8 years after that, Doug and his wife were figuring out what was going on with him medically. And they discovered his spinal cord was still intact, which is amazing. And that the paralysis came from the shattering of this vertebrae. He had hundreds of pieces of vertebrae that were shattered. And that his paralysis came from that. And so over the course of 8 years and much therapy and, different trying of trials of medications and things, he's now walking again. He's got a little wobble to him. He's got, still partial paralysis, and he has to wear a brace occasionally. But he's a motivational author and speaker in Canada now, and just an amazing story from tragedy to triumph and what he's overcome as a result.
Yeah, that really is a beautiful story, and it just shows the gift that you've given in terms of your work and interviewing all of these athletes and all these difference makers within our community. But I guess in addition to meeting all these famous athletes, you also established the 5 rules for success. For someone hearing about it for the first time, what really formed the framework for that idea? And what's the most important thing you hope people walk away with after you speak?
No, I appreciate that. And really, it's anybody that goes through change, not just pro athletes or anybody. Anybody going through a change, what I discovered is there was a commonality of success. And being the simple guy that I am, I thought, boy, I got to remember what these 5 things are. And so I created an acronym, RULES, rules, because, I figured there's always rules in sports, there's rules of the game, there's rules in life. And so it was an easy acronym for me to remember. And each letter stands for something, and each letter means something. So if it's okay, I can briefly share those. This is usually a 60-minute presentation or even sometimes a half-day workshop, but the R stands for refocus. What I've discovered is anybody going through a change has a refocus. And during that refocus, it's a time to evaluate your current goals and establish new goals. And by doing that, you definitely create a new passion and purpose. In other words, let's say you're transitioning from high school to college or from college to whatever. You have to establish that refocus, those new set of goals, a new purpose, a new passion in your life, kind of a strategic plan of where you're going next. It's so important, and that's what the refocus is. Again, we could go really deep on this, but I'm just going to touch upon it for now. The next letter U stands for using your network. What I've discovered is everybody has a network of people around them. And once you establish that refocus, that new purpose, that new goal, you start tapping into your network to say, hey, this is where I'm heading. Can you help me with this? And I always have to qualify. I'm not talking about using and abusing people. I'm not talking about creating win-win relationships. In other words, this is where you want to go with your new refocus and goal. This is somebody that you know or a group of people that you know that could help you with that. Create a win-win with those people as a result. That's using your network. The next letter L, bar none, without argument or any question, is the most difficult for pro athletes, at least. Letting go, letting go. Because as a high caliber athlete, it's in the marrow of our bone to fall down 7 and get up 8, right? We're conditioned to never give up and keep moving forward, regardless of the circumstances. I found that with the military as well. I had a weekly radio show on WJR here in Detroit in which he interviewed military veterans. And, as they're going through their training in the military, they're geared the same way as pro athletes. Like this, you don't give up. You give up, you die, right? And so you got to keep working through this. And so when they transition back to civilian life, that letting go is so difficult, not just for pro athletes, for military and people whose identity has been associated with whatever they've been doing. And as I tell people, it's easier to get to the top of the mountain than stay on the top of the mountain, and letting go is so difficult. Probably one of the best things and best stories from history. You'll learn about me. I love acronyms. I also love history. Is the Roman generals, when they came home from their conquering lands, whether they conquered Alexandria or where they did, they had these parades, and they were called campaigns at that time. It's kind of like a Super Bowl parade. And as these generals were going through these parades in the city of Rome and getting all the accolades, they had somebody on their chariot, and you can read this in history. As they're going through that, they have somebody on their chariot chirping in their ear the whole time as they're going through this great parade, Super Bowl type parade, saying, all glory is fleeting. All glory is fleeting. In other words, so what? Let go, move forward. What's next, right? And so letting go is an important part of moving forward during any change or transition. People leaving from St. Mary's going to Notre Dame or North Central College, right? You got to let go and move forward. You're no longer a high school athlete. You're no longer this, whatever the person is that's in transition. You have to move forward as a result and let go of things and create those new successes. The next letter E stands for execute. What I've discovered, whether it be an individual or organization, is rarely does the change or the process or the refocus and the plan happen exactly the first time that we planned it. Rarely does that happen. And so I like what we call the plan, do, check, and adjust method of executing. In other words, we plan something, which is our refocus. We do it, they check the results. And this is what differs between the haves and the have-nots. We adjust and do it all over again. So as you're going through a change process, whatever that change is, you have to plan, do, check, and then adjust as needed during that change process. Probably the most historic example of that is Thomas Edison when he was creating the filament, looking at the filament for the light bulb. How many times? I mean, I don't know how many times it is. I've heard 1,000, I've heard 10,000, whatever that number is. Or did he simply go through the plan, do, check, and adjust method as he was executing his plan and changes throughout that process? The final letter S stands for someone. What I've discovered is that anybody going through a change successfully had a mentor, somebody that helped them through what was going on in their life and where they wanted to be. as an example, a good friend of mine by the name of Greg Kelser, who played at Michigan State, played in the NBA for a while, is now a broadcaster for the Detroit Pistons. When he was in his heyday of playing in the NBA, he was spending time when he was back in Detroit, back in the studio with a couple TV hosts that he enjoyed being around, and just said, "Hey, let me learn from you. Can you mentor me?" And so as a result, he got great training before he was even done, and now he's in his 35th, 40th year, whatever it is, of TV broadcasting, because he had a mentor that helped him along the way. So RULES. Anybody going through a change or any organization going through a change can apply these. And again, I could spend a half day in a workshop going over each of these very deeply, but we're just touching upon them very briefly as a result.
Yeah, so you built your entire brand around this phrase of like changing like a champion. A
Correct,
little
yes.
Notre Dame-esque, if I do say so myself. But for a young person listening right now who's in the middle of something that they didn't necessarily choose, whether it be a door closing on life, a plan falling apart, an identity they're losing, what does that changing like a champion actually look like on the ground on a hard day?
That's a great question because, as I mentioned, change is, it's not easy. It's not easy, whether it be individual change or organizational change. It can be difficult, and some people embrace change. Other people just, repel from it. And so, it depends on our attitude. It really does. And that's why I want people, as they hear me speak or hear my presentations, understand that, oh, okay, well, let's level the playing field of change. It's not as daunting. It's not this great mountain in front of me. It's something that I can navigate as a result. And I think the biggest thing for anybody going through a change, especially if it's a high school student moving on from high school or college student, the biggest thing is understanding that change is going to happen. They've been talking about change for thousands of years. And here's the biggest thing that I really love about change and don't love about change, unfortunately, is Spencer Johnson wrote in his book, Who Moved My Cheese? And if you're a person that doesn't like change, you might want to read that book. It's called Who Moved My Cheese by Spencer Johnson. And he's got a quote in there that really resonates with me that I use often when I speak. It's this: if you don't change, you could become extinct. If you don't change, you could become extinct. Think about that for a moment as a pro athlete. I'm done playing pro sports. Somebody's done playing pro sport. If they continue living that life of, I'm a pro athlete, I did this, I won a Super Bowl, I won a World Series, you will become extinct. You're not going to remain relevant anymore, right? And so recreating yourself, whether it be a pro athlete or organization, I mean, think about the organizations that became extinct because they didn't change. I could give you a whole list: Kodak, Blockbuster, Toys R Us, BlackBerry, right? The old phones that used to be pretty popular. They didn't change. And as a result, they became extinct. And so it's an important attitude to understand that change is constant. It's going to continue. Humans have been talking about it for thousands of years. And that if we don't change, we could become extinct. And nobody wants to become extinct.
So, Kurt, you left Gaylord, went out and played professionally, built a television show, wrote books, and now you speak to audiences all around the world. What do you hope the students walking those same halls at St. Mary's today take from your story?
I think the biggest thing is that, I hated writing and reading when I was in school. I mean, honestly, I'm going to be point blank with you. When I was in elementary school and high school, I hated writing. But I thank God every day that I listened to those great teachers I had in elementary school and high school, and even my college composition teachers, because those skills were there for me when all of a sudden I had an idea for a book and multiple books now, that I had the foundation to be able to write. And so don't take for granted those lessons that you've learned in school and from the teachers and people and along the journey. I think the biggest thing is, if I can do it, and I joke with people about that, if I can write a book that becomes a bestseller, an Emmy Award-winning TV show, anybody can do it. And I'm being very honest at this point. So, don't short yourself about what you could do. Set your new goals, your new refocus, and then go after them and bring people along the way, right? A tide lifts all boats. And so lift other people up as well. And that's part of my purpose right now. The purpose for the rest of my life is to serve God and serve others through the gifts and abilities that I've been provided. And I've been provided lots of different gifts as a result of different parts of my journey. And I want to use those gifts to serve others and serve God as a result.
So, Kurt, it's been a pleasure to sit down with you. And before we let you go, we end every single episode with the same question.
You have spent your career teaching people, athletes, executives, everyday people, how to face sudden change and come out the other side with something worth having. You have lived it yourself. you know what it costs, and you know what you can build.
So, with all of that, what's one thing we could do today to wake up to a better world tomorrow?
Well, that's a great question. I think the biggest thing is serve God and serve others. When we're so inward focused about ourselves, and I was that way for a long time. I was a performer. I'd classify myself as a performer, right? I had to perform, and performers, unfortunately, are all about us, all about me, right? I think when you start a bigger picture and understand that our purpose on this earth is to serve God and serve others, and use that as the foundation of whatever it is you're doing, whether it be a doctor, a teacher, a scientist, whatever it is, as long as that's the foundation of your motivation of why you get out of bed every day and leave your family or go do whatever you're going to be doing, I think that's the foundation we all have to have in serving God and serving others.
That is everything we could have asked for. Kurt David, everyone, someone who has turned what could have been the worst moment of his life into helping others through theirs. Thank you for being here with us today.
Absolute honor. Thanks, David and Nate, for what you're doing.
If this conversation moved you today, please share it with someone in your community, a neighbor, a parent, a young person trying to figure out where they belong. These stories deserve to be heard. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Inheriting the Future Podcast, and wherever you listen to your favorite shows. We are Inheriting the Future. We'll see you next time.